He robbed banks, escaped prisons, wore 1,000 disguises to stay free. For 20 years, Willie Sutton was untouchable. Then, in the most ordinary of moments, a tailor's son saw him on a subway. The man who had vanished 100 times was caught by a single glance. In the early 1900s, Brooklyn, New York was a place defined by stark contrasts. Row houses and tenements stood alongside the growing prosperity of American industry. For young William Sutton, born June 30th, 1901, in this bustling urban sprawl, the promise of success seemed out of reach. Raised in a working-class Irish-American family, Sutton never completed his education past the 8th grade. He quickly learned to navigate the world of menial jobs, where wages were small and opportunities seemed even smaller. Sutton's early employment included stints as a clerk, a driller, and a gardener. The longest he held a job was 18 months, an indication of his restless nature and growing dissatisfaction with his prospects. He wasn't alone in his frustration. The early 1920s were a time of economic upheaval, and for many young men like Sutton, crime seemed a more enticing route to wealth than honest work. By the time Sutton turned 28, he had become a frequent presence in the underworld of New York. He began committing petty thefts, but soon his ambition and cunning led him to a higher level of criminal activity: bank robbery. Sutton didn't fit the profile of a typical criminal. He was methodical, patient, and particularly skilled at deception. His ability to disguise himself, adopting the persona of a mailman, police officer, or maintenance worker, set him apart from the usual crooks. He was smart, clean-cut, and well-dressed, which gave him an air of confidence that helped him blend into his surroundings. He became known for the actor approach to his crimes, executing robberies with poise and professionalism. Sutton's first major robbery came in 1929, when he successfully targeted a Broadway jewelry store, posing as a postal telegraph messenger. This robbery was bold, executed in broad daylight, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Sutton's ability to disguise himself and stay ahead of the law made him a figure of intrigue in both criminal circles and law enforcement. His ability to execute these robberies with relative ease earned him the nickname Slick Willie. As Sutton's criminal career grew, so did his confidence. He quickly moved on to larger, more daring heists. His most notable early success came in 1933 when, with 2 accomplices, he executed a robbery at the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company in Philadelphia. They entered the bank through a skylight before dawn. Inside, they forced employees into a small room, handcuffing them while they cleaned out the vault. Sutton's fearlessness was evident. He executed these crimes with military precision. The public would come to know Sutton as one of the most elusive criminals in America, but his eventual capture would be anything but conventional. The world Sutton inhabited was one of constant risk and careful calculation. He was always a step ahead, blending in seamlessly with the crowd, never drawing attention to himself. But this lifestyle also carried enormous risk. The more successful his robberies became, the more vulnerable Sutton grew. Prisons and police would eventually catch up with him, but he would not go down easily. Sutton's criminal activities led to his arrest in 1931, resulting in a 30-year sentence. Even behind bars, he demonstrated his trademark resourcefulness, escaping from prison in December 1932, using makeshift ladders. This escape, though bold and well-planned, was just one of many in a series of daring breakouts over the years. For Sutton, the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. Sutton's ability to escape from prison after high-profile robberies earned him a fearsome reputation. Despite mounting risk, he continued to outsmart authorities, evading capture for years, through clever planning and the loyalty of his criminal network. Sutton's repeated escapes became increasingly brazen, and by February 5, 1934, he was apprehended after a high-profile robbery at the Corn Exchange Bank in Philadelphia. Authorities quickly recognized him as one of the most dangerous criminals of the time. He was sentenced to 25 to 50 years at Eastern State Penitentiary, one of the most infamous prisons in America. But even then, Sutton would not be easily contained. Prison life proved to be another challenge for Sutton. He attempted another escape in April 1945, tunneling his way out with a group of prisoners. However, just hours after his escape, he was captured again, bringing his total number of escape attempts to 5. Despite being confined to some of the most secure prisons in the country, Sutton's resourcefulness and creativity in breaking out of captivity earned him a reputation as one of the most dangerous and capable criminals in U.S. history. As Sutton continued his prison sentences, his profile was rapidly increasing. He was soon added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 1950, making him one of the earliest criminals to be featured. He had now become a symbol of the gap between law enforcement and the most innovative criminals. As police methods began to improve, so too did Sutton's efforts to avoid detection. Sutton's notorious love for expensive clothes played a significant role in his eventual downfall. Tailors and police were given his photographs, and it was a tailor's son who finally recognized him. On February 18, 1952, Sutton was spotted by a 24-year-old tailor's son, while riding the New York subway. After following him to a local gas station, the young man contacted the police, and Sutton was arrested without resistance. The man who had once walked into a bank disguised as a postal worker, or cop, was now caught in the middle of an ordinary day. It was a fitting end to his long and storied criminal career. Even after his arrest, Sutton did not resist. He denied any recent crimes, including those committed since his last prison escape in 1947. But his fate was sealed. Sutton owed a life sentence, and 105 additional years for his past crimes. He was further sentenced to 30 years to life in New York State Prison, following a jury trial for a robbery in Queens County Court. By the late 1960s, Sutton's health deteriorated due to emphysema, and he was granted parole in 1969. In 1970, he made an ironic public appearance in a commercial for a bank's new credit card, a striking contrast to his past as a bank robber. Sutton's death in 1980 in Spring Hill, Florida, marked the end of a criminal legend. He lived for 79 years, a remarkable age for a man who had spent nearly half his life in and out of prison, evading the law, and pulling off some of the most daring heists in American history. His story is one of persistence, resourcefulness, and a relentless pursuit of wealth, all framed by the changing landscape of law enforcement and the public's perception of crime. Through his robberies, his escapes, and his final moments of public spectacle, Sutton's life captured the essence of an era in American crime, an era defined by the pursuit of the American dream, no matter the cost. William Sutton's early years in Brooklyn, New York, were defined by an overwhelming sense of dissatisfaction. Born on June 30th, 1901, in a working-class Irish-American family, he was the fourth of 5 children. His life took shape within the crowded streets and modest homes of a neighborhood that offered few opportunities. Sutton left school after 8th grade and entered a world of menial jobs, clerking, drilling, and gardening. He worked these jobs out of necessity, not out of any great passion for the work. His longest stint in a job lasted 18 months, a reflection of his restless nature and his growing frustration with the limitations of his circumstances. The world around him was filled with men who achieved wealth by seizing what they wanted, not by earning it. Sutton realized that the traditional path was not for him. Crime, he believed, was a shortcut to success. By the time he was 28, Sutton had already begun dabbling in smaller crimes, working his way up to more lucrative ventures. He wasn't a petty thief, but a man with grand ambitions. He quickly became fascinated by bank robberies, those jobs that promised not only money, but the thrill of outwitting the law. Sutton, however, wasn't interested in the crude methods of the typical criminal. He was more refined, more calculated. He was a man who didn't need to rob a bank with brute force. He would do it with charm, finesse, and careful planning. In 1929, Sutton's first major heist took place at a Broadway jewelry store. He entered the store disguised as a postal telegraph messenger, blending in with the mundane routine of everyday life. But something went wrong. Sutton wasn't quick enough. The employees took too long to hand over the valuables, and the situation became tense. Sutton had to abort the mission, retreating before he could complete the robbery. Though the heist was a failure, it proved a valuable lesson. With the right disguise and careful planning, he could blend in and rob just about anyone. This failure only fueled Sutton's drive. He refined his methods, studying the behavior of bank employees, the layout of the bank buildings, and the best times to strike. His next target was the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company in Philadelphia, a place he had carefully selected after weeks of observation. It was the perfect target. A bank with predictable hours, few employees, and no substantial security to speak of. On February 15, 1933, Sutton arrived at the bank early, his disguise as a mailman making him virtually invisible in the early morning hours. The bank was still closed, and the streets were quiet. He gained access to the roof and entered the building through a skylight. Inside, Sutton and his 2 accomplices quickly subdued the lone watchman. They forced him to admit the employees, and in no time, the bank was under their control. The workers were handcuffed and locked in a small room, and the robbers took the time to gather the money with precision. The robbery was a success. Sutton's plan had unfolded exactly as he had hoped, and he managed to make off with a substantial amount of cash. The job was clean, efficient, and most importantly, without violence. It was exactly what Sutton had envisioned. He had outwitted the law, outsmarted the bank's security, and executed the perfect robbery. However, this success also marked the beginning of Sutton's rise to infamy. His method of robbing banks with careful preparation and well-planned disguises became his trademark. Unlike other criminals who used force or intimidation, Sutton relied on guile, charm, and his ability to blend into the background. His disguise as a postal worker was just the first of many. Over the course of his career, Sutton would impersonate police officers, messengers, and even maintenance workers, all to gain access to his targets without arousing suspicion. Word spread quickly of his success, and soon Sutton was one of the most notorious criminals in the country. The heist came with greater frequency and increased ambition. By 1934, Sutton had pulled off multiple bank robberies across the country. He was a master at timing, showing up just before banks opened to ensure that the building was still relatively empty. His knowledge of the inner workings of each institution gave him the edge he needed to stay ahead of the law. He was not a violent man by nature, and his calm, controlled demeanor became an asset during these heists. There were no gunshots, no violent confrontations, just the quiet efficiency of a well-executed crime. Sutton's success, however, was not without consequences. His increasingly brazen actions caught the attention of the authorities, and soon he was labeled a fugitive. By January 15, 1934, Sutton was involved in yet another robbery, this time targeting the same Corn Exchange Bank in Philadelphia. This time, however, the robbery was interrupted by the bank's watchman, who arrived earlier than expected. Despite the setback, Sutton's quick thinking allowed him to avoid capture, and he once again disappeared into the shadows. The authorities now knew that Sutton was more than just a criminal. He was a ghost, a figure who could vanish at will. Despite his success, Sutton's criminal career began to take a toll on him. He became a fugitive not just from the law, but from the consequences of his own actions. Every successful robbery brought him closer to being caught. Yet, every time the law came close, he found a way to slip through their fingers. It wasn't just his heist that made him infamous. It was his ability to escape capture. Sutton's life became a pattern of robbery and escape, each event more daring and risky than the last. In June 1932, Sutton was arrested and sentenced to 30 years for assault and robbery. But even behind bars, Sutton was not ready to give up his criminal lifestyle. On December 11, 1932, he made a daring escape from prison, scaling the walls of his cell with a ladder made from two 9-foot sections of wood. He was gone before anyone knew it. His first escape was just a preview of what was to come. This pattern, robbery, escape and recapture, became Sutton's signature. He would be caught, sent to prison, and then escape, only to return to his life of crime. The authorities were forced to change their approach, but no matter what they did, Sutton was always one step ahead. Each time they thought they had him cornered, he found a way to vanish, a way to continue his reign of terror. By March 20th, 1950, Sutton had become one of the most wanted criminals in the United States. He was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, a list that was just beginning to define the face of modern criminal investigation. Sutton's time in the spotlight was only beginning, but for now, the authorities knew one thing for sure. If they were going to catch him, they would need to be smarter, faster, and more resourceful than he was. Sutton was about to enter the next phase of his criminal career. His actions, his decisions, and his ability to stay ahead of the law would soon bring him face to face with the ultimate challenge, captivity. But he wouldn't go down easily, not without one final daring escape. After his arrest in 1934, Sutton's reputation as a master of escape grew. Eastern State Penitentiary, with its imposing stone walls and guarded entrances, seemed like a place where no man could vanish. But Sutton was no ordinary man. The penitentiary, one of the oldest and most secure prisons in the country, was meant to house the most dangerous criminals. Yet Sutton was already planning his next move, his mind constantly ticking, looking for weaknesses in a system designed to contain him. Sutton's first escape from Eastern State Penitentiary was one of his most audacious. The prison, notorious for its isolated design, housed men in solitary confinement with a strict regimen of work and exercise. But for Sutton, it was just another challenge to overcome. In April 1945, he orchestrated a tunnel escape, planning every detail with precision. He wasn't the only one involved. Sutton had formed an alliance with a group of other prisoners. Together, they worked secretly to dig a tunnel under the walls. It was a meticulous operation, carried out in the dead of night, with each man contributing his part. The night they made their escape, Sutton and his fellow inmates crawled through the dark, narrow tunnel they had dug for weeks. As they emerged on the other side of the prison walls, a sense of freedom surged through Sutton. They had bypassed one of the most secure facilities in the nation, and now they were free. But their celebration was short-lived. Within hours, Sutton was back in police custody. He had been recaptured by Philadelphia police within a day of his escape. The escape, though short-lived, was a reminder of Sutton's resolve. He wasn't deterred by the failure. Instead, it only intensified his determination. His confidence grew. He knew that no matter how secure the prison was, there was always a way out. His legend continued to grow, not just because of his robberies, but because of his almost supernatural ability to escape. Sutton was the man who defied the odds, the man who could vanish at will. The next time Sutton found himself locked away in a maximum security facility, he made sure it wouldn't be so easy for authorities to catch him. In 1947, after a failed robbery and subsequent recapture, Sutton was sent to Philadelphia County Prison, a facility known for its strict surveillance. But Sutton, ever the strategist, was already working on his next escape. This time he had an entirely new plan. Disguise. Sutton was known for his ability to blend in, and he used that skill once again. He and a few other inmates planned to dress as prison guards. In the cover of darkness, Sutton and his group managed to sneak out of their cells and into the prison yard, ladders in tow. They didn't rush. They moved carefully, as if they belonged there. The searchlights from the prison towers swept across the yard, but Sutton knew the timing had to be perfect. At the right moment, Sutton shouted, "It's okay." The guards, thinking it was a routine check, didn't stop them. Sutton and the others managed to get to the prison walls, where they set up their ladders, using the tools they had smuggled in. As they scaled the walls, Sutton knew he was in control again. But as he reached the top, something unexpected happened. The searchlights swept across the yard and caught the group in their beam. Sutton didn't hesitate. He yelled again, "It's okay." This time the guards didn't believe him. Gunshots rang out as the police rushed to intercept them. Sutton's escape, while unsuccessful, was yet another demonstration of his ability to operate under pressure. He was recaptured the same night, his plan foiled by a matter of seconds. Yet even in defeat, Sutton had made a statement. He wasn't a man to be easily captured or contained. Each failed escape only served to build his legend further. Sutton became a symbol of defiance, a man who could never truly be subdued. Over the next several years, Sutton was moved between prisons, but no matter where he went, the authorities knew one thing. Sutton was not someone who could be kept behind bars, and Sutton, in turn, began to recognize the limits of his escapes. There were always risks involved, but even as his efforts became more daring, Sutton never lost his focus. His mind was always turning, always looking for a new opportunity, a new way to outsmart the system. In the late 1940s, as Sutton grew older and more determined, he started to grow weary of the constant back and forth between his robberies and his captures. But even then, he would not stop. His legacy, as both a bank robber and a prison escape artist, had already been cemented. Every heist, every jailbreak, brought him closer to the myth that had grown up around him. A myth that made Sutton seem invincible. Yet the authorities were closing in. As Sutton's criminal career unfolded, the law enforcement community began to adjust. The FBI started taking a deeper interest in his operations, tracking his movements across the country. Sutton was no longer just a local criminal. He had become a national figure. By the time Sutton was added to the FBI's top 10 most wanted list in 1950, his reputation was solidified. He wasn't just another criminal. He was one of the most wanted men in the country. He was no longer just a bank robber. He had become something more, a symbol of resistance, of intelligence over brute force. Sutton wasn't just robbing banks. He was defying the very institutions that tried to capture him. As Sutton faced yet another lengthy prison sentence, he knew that his days of freedom would be limited. But he was not one to go quietly. Sutton was planning his next escape, and this time, it would be his most daring move yet. No prison, no matter how secure, would hold him for long. The stage was set for another great escape, and Sutton was ready to take his place in criminal history once again. As the 1950s unfolded, Sutton's criminal exploits had made him a household name. His image appearing on wanted posters, his exploits discussed in whispered tones among law enforcement officials. He was a man whose very name became synonymous with daring bank heists and incredible escapes. But now, the game had shifted. The law had started to adapt, and Sutton found himself in the crosshairs of an increasingly determined FBI. As Sutton spent time behind bars, his mind continued to churn. He knew that he had to get out. Again, and this time, he would escape under their noses. The problem wasn't just prison walls. It was the tightening grip of law enforcement. As the FBI began intensifying its search, Sutton realized that he couldn't escape the same way twice. The authorities were catching on. They were learning, adapting, and soon, they would be watching for the very tactics he had used to elude capture. But Sutton wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. His disguises were always changing, always adapting. Whether it was a postal worker, police officer, or maintenance man, Sutton had perfected the art of impersonation. He moved in and out of banks, robbing them with surgical precision, never lingering too long. But he could never stay quiet for long, and it was only a matter of time before the law would catch up. In February 1952, Sutton's luck finally ran out. After years of successful escapes, his downfall came from the most unexpected of places, a subway ride in New York City. On February 18, 1952, Sutton, now 51 years old, was spotted by Arnold Schuster, the 24-year-old son of a tailor. Schuster had seen Sutton's photograph on an FBI wanted poster that had been sent to local tailors in the city. The image of Sutton's sharply dressed figure, his impeccable style, was something that stuck out in a crowd. Schuster's recognition of Sutton was the break law enforcement had been waiting for. He followed Sutton from the subway to a nearby gas station, where Sutton stopped to buy a battery for his car. Schuster didn't hesitate. He went straight to the police. Within hours, Sutton was captured without incident. It was a stunning end to Sutton's reign of terror. The capture was both a triumph and a disappointment for law enforcement. Sutton had been one of the most elusive criminals in history, a man who had slipped through their fingers on multiple occasions. Yet in the end, it was not a daring escape that led to his capture. It was the watchful eyes of a civilian who happened to recognize him. The irony was not lost on Sutton. He had spent decades outsmarting the law, and now it was a chance encounter that brought him down. Sutton was taken into custody, and this time there would be no escape. He was immediately sentenced to serve out his sentence for the Corn Exchange Bank robbery and other crimes committed during his spree. The law had finally caught up with him, but it was clear that Sutton's story was far from over. He had outwitted the authorities for years, and his legendary escapes had become part of the folklore surrounding him. But now, the authorities were determined to make sure he never saw freedom again. As Sutton was transferred to New York's Sing Sing prison, he faced the daunting reality of being confined to a high-security facility. For a man who had lived his entire life on the run, the walls of a prison were a form of containment he hadn't experienced in over 20 years. Sutton knew that the days of easy escapes were behind him. But for a man like Sutton, no prison could ever be truly secure. There was always a way out, always another plan, always another opportunity to evade the law. Sutton's capture was not just a personal defeat. It was also a turning point in the way authorities approached fugitives. Sutton had become a symbol of the law's inability to keep up with criminals who were clever enough to evade capture. But now, with him behind bars, the system would change. Sutton had inadvertently taught the FBI and local law enforcement valuable lessons about pursuing elusive criminals. The authorities knew they couldn't afford to take their eyes off him, even in the prison system. Meanwhile, Sutton had time to reflect. His escape attempts had become part of his identity. It was as if his freedom had been a game, and the prison walls just another barrier to be broken. He was no longer just a bank robber. He had become an icon. And even behind bars, Sutton's mind never stopped working. He was already planning his next escape. The law, however, was closing in. Sutton had evaded it for years, but there were now fewer avenues for him to exploit. The FBI's manhunt had brought the full weight of law enforcement on him, and Sutton, despite his incredible skill, knew that his time was running out. Yet, as his reputation grew, so did the legend of the man who had never been caught until the moment the odds finally caught up with him. The stage was set. Sutton had been captured, but his journey wasn't over. He was now a man with a new reputation, one that was harder to escape than even the most secure prison walls. The next chapter of his story would be defined not by his ability to break out of prisons, but by the ways in which the system would eventually force him to face the consequences of his past. Sutton had always been one step ahead, but now, for the first time, the law was ready for him. After years of outwitting the law, Sutton was finally behind bars. But even captivity could not suppress his restless nature. Sing Sing prison, a notorious maximum security facility, had long been a place where only the most dangerous criminals were held, and it seemed a fitting location for someone like Sutton. Yet, for a man who had escaped high-security prisons twice, being locked away in Sing Sing did not feel like an end. It felt like a temporary setback. Sutton's mind never ceased working, always calculating, always planning his next move. Sutton knew that his time in the prison system was nearing its final stretch. He had already served much of his original sentence for the Corn Exchange Bank robbery and was facing new charges for other heists. Yet he had something many inmates lacked: the knowledge that escape was still possible, even from the most secure prisons. Sing Sing, for all its security, was not impregnable. Sutton had learned how to exploit the smallest details in prison architecture: an overlooked blind spot in a guard's patrol route, a poorly maintained section of the prison wall. He had escaped from worse. He was not done yet. For the first time in years, Sutton found himself reflecting on the path his life had taken. The robberies, the escapes, the constant race between freedom and capture, all of it had led to this point. Yet, Sutton was not a man to rest on his laurels. Even in prison, he remained a threat. The plan was already forming in his mind, and this time, it would be more daring than ever. But Sutton was no fool. He knew that escaping from Sing Sing would not be easy. The prison was designed to hold men like him, men who had made a career out of escaping from captivity. The guards were trained to recognize criminals who might attempt to break free, and the prison itself was surrounded by high walls, watchtowers, and searchlights. Yet, Sutton's confidence remained unshaken. He had done it before, and he would do it again. All he needed was the right moment. It was in February 1947, after years of planning, that Sutton saw his chance. He had spent months gathering information, watching the guards, learning the schedules, and understanding the flaws in the prison's security. He had befriended several other inmates who shared his desire for freedom, and together they worked on the plan. This time Sutton would escape not through brute force or elaborate tunnels, but by taking advantage of the one thing he had always relied on: disguise. In the dead of night, Sutton and his accomplices executed the plan. They dressed as prison guards. The strategy was simple, but risky. By impersonating the very men who were tasked with keeping them in prison, they could move undetected across the prison grounds. Sutton had always been a master of disguise, and this was no different. He knew how to act the part, how to speak the language of the guards, how to move with authority. He even knew how to fool the guards in the watchtowers, because he had watched them, studied their routines, and understood their weaknesses. They moved swiftly, unnoticed by the other prisoners. The searchlights swept across the yard, but Sutton's group blended in seamlessly. They had prepared for this moment, each detail calculated with precision. The moment they reached the outer wall, they set up their ladders, just as they had done in the past. It was a moment of pure adrenaline. Sutton could feel the weight of the escape, the rush of freedom just within reach. As they began to scale the wall, everything seemed to fall into place. But then, just as Sutton reached the top, disaster struck. The prison searchlights flicked on, casting a harsh beam across the yard. Sutton was exposed. The guards who had been fooled up until that point now saw them clearly. The plan had failed, just by a few seconds. Sutton's escape, once again, was foiled. The guards opened fire, but Sutton was already on the other side of the wall, scrambling to find cover. The FBI and local authorities were soon alerted, and by the next morning, Sutton was back in custody. His escape had failed, but his defiance remained undiminished. Even in failure, Sutton had shown the authorities that he could still evade them. It was a bitter defeat, but it was not the end. In the aftermath of his failed escape, Sutton found himself in the Philadelphia County Prison, facing a new round of charges for his involvement in the latest escape attempt. Yet even in this moment of defeat, Sutton was undeterred. He spent his days in prison, planning his next move. It was clear to him that this would not be his final incarceration. No matter how many times they caught him, he would always find a way to escape. Authorities knew that Sutton was not just a common criminal. He had become a symbol of defiance, a man who had beaten the system time and again. The FBI's efforts to contain him were intensified, and they began to look for ways to prevent Sutton from ever escaping again. Yet, in the back of their minds, they knew something that was impossible to ignore. Willie Sutton had never been defeated. As Sutton sat in his cell, preparing for his next escape, the world outside had begun to change. The FBI was evolving, becoming more sophisticated in its tracking methods, and more willing to devote the necessary resources to capturing men like Sutton. The man who had once been able to slip through the cracks was now being hunted by a government determined to bring him to justice. But Sutton's legend was far from over. The next move would be the most daring yet, and this time, the stakes would be higher than ever before. The question was no longer whether Sutton could escape. It was whether he could outlast the authorities, who were now closing in on him from every angle. Sutton knew one thing for sure: freedom was always within reach. By the early 1950s, Sutton had become a household name. His face, his escapes, and his crimes were known across the country. Law enforcement agencies, most notably the FBI, had placed him at the top of their priority list. But the elusive bank robber, an escape artist, was not going down without a fight. He had become the symbol of defiance, the ultimate challenge for law enforcement. His image had been plastered on wanted posters across the nation, and his FBI wanted poster was one of the first distributed widely, making him an iconic figure in the criminal world. Yet, despite the national manhunt, Sutton continued to evade capture with remarkable skill. But with his growing infamy came increasing pressure. The authorities were not going to let him slip away again. The FBI had gathered all its resources, monitoring every potential escape route, using new technologies to track him. Sutton had no choice but to adapt. But with the authorities closing in, his once masterful ability to disappear became harder and harder to maintain. Sutton's life behind bars had become just as much about survival as it was about evasion. In the small confines of Sing Sing prison, he lived under constant scrutiny. The guards knew his reputation, and they were vigilant. They recognized him for what he was, a serial escape artist who had repeatedly outsmarted their predecessors. But for Sutton, the isolation of prison was merely a challenge. The only thing that mattered was escaping again. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about proving once more that he could escape anything and everything. In 1950, Sutton's face appeared on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. This list was a new initiative to catch America's most dangerous criminals, and it was now the focal point for every law enforcement agency in the country. Sutton was the 11th person ever placed on the list. His inclusion was no surprise. He had been eluding capture for years, and the authorities knew they had to bring him in. The FBI was determined, and Sutton was now a national symbol of what the agency had yet to conquer: a criminal who couldn't be caught. Yet, even as the FBI escalated its efforts, Sutton remained calm. He knew they were watching him, but he was used to being watched. It was part of the game. The question now was whether they would catch him before he escaped again. The only way to win was to outsmart them. Just as he had done countless times before, every move Sutton made, every decision he took, was made with one goal: escape. This time, however, the escape would be different. He was older now, more experienced, but the stakes had grown much higher. Sutton's status as one of the FBI's most wanted criminals made headlines. People began to see him as more than just a criminal. They began to view him as a symbol of resistance against authority. To some, he was the ultimate anti-hero, a man who took what he wanted, who outwitted the law at every turn. Newspapers began to follow his story, and his robberies became more than just criminal acts. They became the subject of fascination. His sharp dress and composed manner during the robberies earned him the nickname the Actor, a man who played a role every time he walked into a bank, a man who could transform into any character he wanted, from a police officer to a maintenance worker. But the longer Sutton remained free, the greater the pressure grew on law enforcement. With each passing year, his legend grew, but so did the resources devoted to his capture. The FBI's most wanted list was more than just a list of criminals. It was a challenge to the law enforcement community to capture the most elusive figures in the country. Sutton knew this, and he relished the attention. It only fed his drive. But as the manhunt intensified, Sutton found himself cornered in ways he never had before. The world was changing, and the tactics he had once used to evade capture were becoming less effective. The challenge now was greater than ever before. With the nation's eyes on him, Sutton couldn't afford to be reckless. He had to adapt. But he couldn't stop the inevitable. His criminal career had built a legacy of escapes and robberies that were now the stuff of legend. Yet, even as he tried to stay ahead of the law, his luck was beginning to run out. His escapes, once executed with ease, were becoming more difficult. The authorities were finally starting to catch up. It was during this period of escalating pressure that Sutton made his most significant mistake. He underestimated the consequences of his fame. His previous escapes had been calculated risks, but the public spotlight had added new dangerous layers to his decisions. As the FBI increased its focus on him, Sutton was no longer able to maintain his usual composure. He became more careless, more reckless in his attempts to elude capture. This would prove to be his downfall. Sutton's image as a dashing, debonair criminal was at odds with the mounting reality of his situation. The more he was hunted, the more his criminal career became a matter of survival. He wasn't just a bank robber anymore. He was a man whose every action had to be calculated for the purpose of his own freedom. The cost of that freedom was beginning to take its toll, and Sutton found himself trapped in a web of his own making. His every decision, every escape attempt, became more desperate as the authorities closed in on him. Despite his growing desperation, Sutton maintained his calm facade. He would not give up. He had never given up. And he wasn't going to start now. The challenge was greater than ever. But Sutton had always thrived on challenges. He was about to make his next move. The world would soon see whether he could outsmart the FBI once again. But this time, Sutton had more to lose than ever before. His fame had brought him into the public eye, but it had also made him more vulnerable than he had ever been. The law was closing in. But so was the moment when Sutton would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to preserve his freedom. Would he continue to escape? Or would he finally be caught? The tension was building, and Sutton knew the answer. He wouldn't stop until he had one more escape. No matter the cost, the tension of Sutton's life in hiding had grown unbearable. For a man who had spent nearly 2 decades evading capture, 1952 marked a pivotal year in his criminal career. His every move was now under a microscope, and the very fame he had once enjoyed now became his greatest liability. The authorities, particularly the FBI, had redoubled their efforts to catch him. He was no longer just a fugitive. He had become a symbol of everything law enforcement was fighting against. His photograph, once merely a tool for local police departments, now graced walls across the nation. He had become the personification of resistance to authority, the man who had slipped through every net thrown over him. The net was tightening, but Sutton remained elusive, his ability to blend into the background as sharp as ever. In the streets of New York, he was a shadow, always moving, always alert, never staying in one place for long. Yet, despite his careful planning, there were cracks in his armor. The more Sutton evaded the law, the more it seemed like he was playing a game of cat and mouse with fate itself. He had become arrogant, overconfident, even, relying on his past success and his skill in disguise to carry him through. But like all legends, his time was running out. By February 18th, 1952, Sutton had been on the run for nearly 2 decades, but the fateful encounter that would end his freedom happened in the most ordinary of circumstances. A subway ride in New York City. Arnold Schuster, a 24-year-old tailor's son, recognized Sutton on the subway platform. Schuster had seen Sutton's wanted poster numerous times, sent to local tailors, to help identify the man who had made headlines with his daring escapes. It was Sutton's immaculately sharp attire that gave him away. He stood out in the crowd, just as he had stood out in the banks he had robbed. To Schuster, it wasn't just a face in a crowd, it was a criminal. an icon of defiance, who had eluded the law for too long. Schuster followed Sutton off the subway and into a nearby gas station, where Sutton purchased a battery for his car. Schuster, realizing the gravity of his discovery, quickly made a decision. Instead of confronting Sutton, he called the police. He reported the sighting, the most pivotal tip that would eventually bring Sutton to justice. Schuster's decision to contact the authorities sealed Sutton's fate. In 1952, Sutton was captured after being recognized by a tailor's son in New York City. Arrested without resistance, his long run of evading the law ended quietly, a stark contrast to his dramatic escapes. But the impact was undeniable. For Sutton, the capture was an unavoidable consequence of his own increasing carelessness. The world that had once admired him for his cunning had now turned against him. The public's fascination with his every move was part of his undoing. As the spotlight shone brighter on him, Sutton became more vulnerable. He hadn't just been trying to outwit the law anymore. He had been playing to the crowd, feeding the myth of himself as an untouchable figure. Once in custody, Sutton didn't resist, but he denied committing any robberies or crimes since his last escape in 1947. The authorities had expected him to fight, to attempt another last-ditch escape, but he seemed resigned, even almost relieved. The game was up. He had played his cards for as long as he could, but the walls had finally closed in on him. Now the once untouchable criminal was just another man in handcuffs. Sutton was taken to New York's Sing Sing prison, where he would face additional charges related to his robberies and escape attempts. The FBI had finally succeeded in apprehending him, but his legacy had already been cemented. His name would live on, not just as a bank robber, but as a symbol of how the law had to evolve to deal with criminals like him. Sutton's arrest was more than just a capture. It was a turning point for both the FBI and the country's approach to criminal investigations. As Sutton sat in his cell, waiting for his trial, his mind raced. He had once been the man who outwitted the system time and again, but now he was just another criminal. The fame he had once enjoyed had faded, and in its place was a reality he could not escape. But Sutton's mind was always sharp, and as much as his body was shackled, his mind remained free. He began to plan his next move, his next escape. He knew the authorities were watching him closely, but that didn't matter. He had outwitted them before, and he could do it again. This was just another chapter in his story, a story that had seen multiple beginnings and countless reinventions. But the world had changed. The FBI had become more sophisticated. The system had adapted to Sutton's methods. For the first time in his life, Willie Sutton realized that his time was running out. He was no longer the ghost who slipped through the cracks. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions. The life of crime he had led had taken him to this moment. But now it was clear. No more escapes, no more robberies. His capture marked the end of an era, the conclusion to a career that had defied the odds for years. The final chapter of Sutton's life as a criminal was now unfolding, and as he sat behind bars, Sutton knew one thing for sure. He had played the game for as long as he could, but the law had finally caught up with him. His freedom, and the thrill that came with it, was gone. And now all that was left was the consequence of a life lived in defiance. In the aftermath of his capture, Sutton's story became a focal point of public attention. The authorities, now with a notorious criminal in custody, prepared for a trial that would solidify his fate. Sutton's trial was a spectacle, one that captivated the nation, and drew attention not just for his crimes, but for the larger questions his actions had raised. How could a man, so skilled in evasion, be held accountable for his years of crime? Could the justice system truly contain him, or would he slip away yet again? Sutton was facing a lengthy prison sentence. His criminal history was well documented, from his daring bank heists to his multiple prison escapes. The FBI had been tracking him for years, and each of his robberies and escapes was cataloged with the kind of detail that painted him as both a criminal genius and an untouchable fugitive. Sutton was at this point a symbol of the law's inability to keep up with the most dangerous criminals. But now he was a man facing his reckoning. The trial began in New York, where Sutton stood accused of his involvement in several robberies, including the Corn Exchange bank heist, and his repeated escapes from prison. The charges against him were serious. Sutton's record had made him one of the most wanted criminals in the country, but his public persona made him a complicated figure. He was no ordinary criminal. To the public, he was an enigma, a man who had escaped prison walls, outrun the law, and carried out his crimes with a precision that made him a living legend. Despite his infamous reputation, Sutton's defense team tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Sutton was not the violent criminal the authorities had made him out to be, that his robberies had been victimless in nature, and that his involvement in violent escapes had been out of a desperate desire to escape a broken system. Sutton, for his part, remained composed throughout the trial, denying involvement in any crimes since his last escape in 1947. But the evidence against him was irrefutable. He was a man whose actions had led to an undeniable trail of destruction, And now, he was being held accountable. The prosecution focused on the numerous bank robberies Sutton had carried out over the years, highlighting the precision and planning behind each job. They presented evidence of his repeated escapes, his use of disguises, and his ability to evade capture for years. Despite the best efforts of law enforcement, it became clear that Sutton was not just a man who robbed banks. He was a man who had systematically defied every attempt to bring him to justice. The prosecution painted him as a criminal who had no intention of stopping, who had turned crime into an art form. As the trial progressed, it was clear that Sutton had one advantage: his reputation. The courtroom was filled with spectators, many of whom had heard about Sutton for years, and now they were eager to see him face justice. He was no longer just a criminal. He had become a public figure, a man whose story had reached far beyond the criminal underworld. His story had taken on a mythic quality. Sutton had become a figure larger than life, one whose crimes were as much a part of American folklore as they were a reflection of the darker aspects of the human condition. Despite the public fascination with him, Sutton's fate was sealed. The trial ended in conviction. He was found guilty on multiple counts, including his involvement in several high-profile bank robberies, his repeated escapes from prison, and his role in organizing elaborate heists that had eluded authorities for years. The evidence was overwhelming, and Sutton once again found himself at the mercy of a system he had spent so long evading. Sutton was sentenced to life imprisonment, but even now, the authorities knew that the battle wasn't over. Sutton was a man who had outwitted the law for decades, and there was no guarantee that his time behind bars would be any different. The question on everyone's mind was, would he try to escape again? Could he escape again? The possibility that Sutton would find a way to break free haunted the authorities. The FBI, aware of his record, took every precaution to ensure that Sutton would never again slip through their fingers. Despite the trial's conclusion, Sutton never lost his cool. His calm demeanor in the face of conviction was characteristic of the man who had never let the law get the better of him. He remained a figure of fascination, even as the reality of his situation became clear. His legacy, as one of the most skilled criminals in history, would live on. But now, he was no longer the man who had evaded capture. He was just another convict, facing the consequences of his actions. Yet, even in prison, Sutton's presence continued to be felt. His name became synonymous with escape, with defiance, and with the unrelenting pursuit of freedom. For law enforcement, his capture and conviction marked the end of an era. Sutton's story had captured the public's imagination. But now, it was time for him to face the consequences of his life of crime. The story of Willie Sutton, the man who robbed banks and escaped prisons, had come full circle. He had lived his life on his own terms, and now the law had caught up with him. But even in captivity, Sutton remained a figure who would be remembered not just for his crimes, but for the legacy of defiance he had left behind. The trial may have been over, but Sutton's myth would continue to echo for years to come. As the 1950s unfolded, Sutton's life behind bars was marked by an eerie quiet. The man who had once been the subject of a nationwide manhunt, who had executed countless daring heists and escapes, now found himself confined to a prison cell. Yet even in captivity, Sutton remained a larger-than-life figure. His criminal legacy, one of meticulous planning, calculated risks, and a near supernatural ability to escape, had transformed him into a symbol of defiance against authority. The authorities, however, were relentless in their efforts to ensure that Sutton would never again taste freedom. For Sutton, his life in prison was a drastic departure from the constant thrill of evading the law. The isolation of the cell seemed like a far cry from the adrenaline of his robberies, the calculated precision with which he had carried out his schemes. Yet even in his confinement, his mind remained sharp, constantly analyzing, constantly looking for ways to outmaneuver the system that had finally caught up with him. His years of eluding capture had taught him one thing: freedom was always a possibility, even behind bars. But Sutton's age and health were beginning to betray him. By 1960, he was in his late 50s, his body worn by years of physical exertion and the toll of his relentless lifestyle. The emphysema that had plagued him in his later years began to worsen. He had already lived longer than most criminals, and his health was now in decline. The authorities were aware of his condition, but there was no question of leniency. Sutton had earned his place in history as a man who had continuously defied the law, and now he would face the consequences. While his body weakened, Sutton's mind remained sharp. He spent his days reflecting on the choices he had made, on the life he had lived. Bank robberies, escape attempts, prison escapes. They were all part of a pattern, a game he had played with the law, a game he had learned to master. Yet, as his health declined, he knew his time was running out. The idea of escaping again, of walking free, seemed like a distant fantasy. There was no more escaping the inevitable. Willie Sutton, the man who had once been untouchable, was facing his own mortality. In 1969, After nearly 35 years of incarceration, Sutton's fate took a strange turn. At the age of 68, with his health failing, he was granted parole. It was a surprising decision, given his notorious criminal history. But prison officials, recognizing his declining health, decided that he would no longer pose a threat to society. Sutton, who had spent most of his life evading capture, was now facing his final chapter behind prison walls. He was released on Christmas Eve that year, a day that held deep significance for a man who had spent most of his adult life in the shadows of crime. For a moment, it seemed as though Sutton had won again. He had managed to escape the grasp of the prison system one last time, albeit not through his usual cunning methods, but by sheer force of circumstance. But Sutton's freedom was not to last long. He had been a legend in his time, and even as an old man, he remained a figure of fascination. His release drew media attention, but it was also a bitter irony. A man who had spent decades evading the law was now free, but only because of his failing health. Sutton, despite all his escapes and robberies, had reached the end of the line. The public reaction to his release was mixed. Some saw it as a final victory, a fitting end to the career of a man who had made headlines for years. Others saw it as a final tragedy, a man who had lived his life as an outlaw, now reduced to an old man with little to offer. Sutton's release was a reminder that freedom had a cost, and for all his cleverness, Sutton had ultimately been a prisoner of his own choices. Sutton's post-prison life was brief and filled with irony. He became an advertising figure, appearing in a television commercial for a bank in New Britain, Connecticut, where he promoted a new photo credit card system. The man who had once robbed banks now found himself promoting the very thing he had spent his life stealing from. It was a surreal moment, one that seemed to capture the essence of Sutton's life. A criminal who had spent years evading the law was now participating in mainstream American capitalism, albeit in a strange and ironic way. But Sutton's health continued to deteriorate, and by November 2nd, 1980, the man who had once defied the system for so long passed away. He was 79 years old. The man who had been a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and defiance was gone, and his death marked the end of an era. His criminal career had spanned decades, and though his final years were marked by illness and confinement, his legacy remained. Sutton had been more than just a bank robber. He had been a figure who embodied the struggle between individual freedom and societal control. He had made his name by outsmarting the system, by turning the very rules meant to contain him into tools he could manipulate. And though his final days were quiet, the myth of Willie Sutton lived on. In the end, Sutton's life was defined by his ability to defy the odds. He had escaped from prisons, carried out daring heists, and become a legend, not just for his crimes, but for the way he had lived his life outside the law. His story was one of constant reinvention, of a man who refused to be bound by the system, who refused to accept defeat. But in the final analysis, Sutton's life was a reminder that even the most elusive criminal could not escape the consequences of time. His death, though quiet, was the final act in the story of a man who had defied capture for so long. Willie Sutton's legend would continue to echo through history, not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of defiance, a man who had turned escape into an art form. And in that, his legacy would endure, even as the world moved on. The news of Willie Sutton's death in 1980 was met with mixed reactions. But for those who had followed his criminal career, it was more than just the passing of a man. It marked the end of an era. Sutton's life had become a cautionary tale, one that was recounted in hushed tones among law enforcement and criminal circles alike. His ability to evade capture for years, his near-mythical status as an escape artist, and the calculated precision with which he executed his robberies made him a figure larger than life. But as his death was reported, the mythos surrounding him only grew stronger. Willie Sutton, the master criminal, had been defeated by the inevitable passage of time, but the story he had left behind was far from finished. In the years following his death, Sutton's life continued to shape the way law enforcement approached high-profile criminals. His story was not just a tale of theft and violence. It was a lesson in the evolution of the criminal mind and the cat-and-mouse game between criminals and the authorities. For the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, Sutton had become a symbol of the changing nature of criminal investigations in the 20th century. He had exposed the weaknesses in the system, how a criminal could slip through the cracks with the right combination of ingenuity, timing, and audacity. The lessons Sutton had unwittingly taught were ones that law enforcement could never forget. Sutton's criminal career, which had spanned decades, was a stark contrast to the increasingly sophisticated methods employed by law enforcement in the 1950s and 1960s. In his time, Sutton had outsmarted the police with disguises, careful planning, and precise execution. He had become a symbol of how a criminal could circumvent the system. However, in his later years, he began to realize that the world was changing, and his old methods were no longer as effective as they once were. The FBI had grown more sophisticated, the criminal justice system had modernized, and new technologies, such as improved surveillance systems, forensic techniques, and database networks were changing the game. Sutton had escaped prison walls and eluded capture time and time again, but his final years in prison, coupled with his deteriorating health, were a reminder of the limits of even the most brilliant criminal. Sutton's death prompted a wave of media interest that transformed his life into myth. The press and public began to revisit his story, poring over the details of his life, his robberies, and his escapes. He had become a symbol, not just of criminal ingenuity, but of resilience. A man who had for years remained beyond the reach of law enforcement. This media coverage would cement Sutton's place in history as one of the most infamous criminals of the early 20th century. A man whose name would remain synonymous with bank robberies, prison breaks, and elusive fugitives. As the years went by, Sutton's legacy continued to influence not just criminal activity, but the very structure of law enforcement itself. His ability to escape prison time and time again exposed the vulnerabilities in the prison system, and it led to a more systematic approach in handling high-profile prisoners. Prison security tightened, and authorities began to recognize the need for more sophisticated tools and strategies to contain criminals like Sutton. His escapes were no longer seen as random events. They were seen as the result of a systematic flaw in the way criminals were handled, and Sutton's story became a catalyst for the modernization of the justice system. But for those who had been affected by Sutton's crimes, the bank employees, the victims of his robberies, his legacy was less romanticized. His years of crime had cost them much more than just money. Sutton's robberies had been calculated and professional, but they had also left a trail of fear and destruction in their wake. The employees who had been handcuffed, the families who had been traumatized by the robberies, and the communities that had lived in the shadow of Sutton's crimes all bore the scars of his actions. For them, Sutton was not a legend or a hero. He was a criminal who had caused real harm. Law enforcement learned from Sutton's criminal career, and his story was used to train the next generation of agents. His escapes had forced the FBI to rethink its tactics. His robberies had highlighted the importance of tracking not just the criminal, but the pattern of crimes, the psychology of the criminal mind, and the need to stay ahead of the game. Sutton had been able to elude authorities because he was always one step ahead. But his capture, his conviction, and his eventual death had taught the law that the game of cat and mouse could only last so long. Sutton's capture, after all, had come as a result of civilian intervention, not some daring last-minute chase or escape. The world of criminal justice had begun to recognize that even the most elusive criminals could be caught, not just by law enforcement, but by the community itself. After his death, Sutton's legacy continued to loom large. His life had been a constant battle against the system, and his story became a blueprint for both criminals and law enforcement. To criminals, Sutton's career was a lesson in how to execute heists with precision, how to avoid capture through disguise and planning, and how to create a myth around one's own criminal career. To law enforcement, Sutton's story was a warning, a reminder that even the most organized criminals could slip through the cracks unless the system evolved to keep up. Sutton evolved from a criminal to a legend, known not just for his robberies, but for his uncanny ability to escape the law, cementing his place in American criminal history. The year was 1980, and Willie Sutton had become a figure of the past, a symbol of a bygone era. His once infamous name had faded into the background, overshadowed by more recent criminals and modern challenges for law enforcement. Yet Sutton's legacy had left an indelible mark on the fabric of American criminal history. His life had been one of audacious heists, daring escapes, and an uncanny ability to remain one step ahead of the law for over 2 decades. The myth of Willie Sutton, the master of evasion, had persisted even after his capture, even after his death. It had become a living testament to the fragility of justice, the elusive nature of freedom, and the lengths one could go to in order to escape the system. Sutton had spent his final years behind bars, sick and aging. At 68, his health was failing, the once strong body of the infamous criminal now marked by the years of his reckless lifestyle. Emphysema, a byproduct of his decades of chain smoking and the stress of his criminal activities, was rapidly deteriorating his lungs. He could no longer run from the law, not physically, at least, but his mind, sharp as ever, still considered escape. Not in the traditional sense of breaking out of a prison, but in his final, most audacious escape yet, escaping death itself. Sutton's release from Attica State Prison on Christmas Eve of 1969 was a last twist in his life. His health, paired with good behavior over the years, had earned him a parole, an irony that few could have predicted for a man who had escaped from some of the most notorious prisons in the country. However, his years of freedom were short-lived. By the time he was released, Sutton was a frail shadow of the man he had once been. Gone were the sleek suits and polished appearances. He was now just a relic of the past, a former criminal living on borrowed time. Despite his frailty, Sutton found himself thrust into the media spotlight once again, his story became more of a curiosity than a criminal case. Television interviews, where he recounted his life of crime and escape, further perpetuated the public's fascination with him. But the irony of his post-prison life was too apparent. The bank robber was now endorsing a credit card commercial for a Connecticut bank, symbolizing the strange, surreal turn his life had taken. To many, Sutton had become a living ghost, a criminal turned media figure, a paradox that the public could not look away from. However, Sutton's final years were far from peaceful. His decline in health was swift, and by the time 1980 rolled around, his legend had almost completely dissipated from the minds of the public. He had escaped the law time and time again, but in the end, it was time itself that had caught up with him. The man who had once managed to escape from the most secure prisons was now helpless in the face of natural decline. On November 2nd, 1980, Willie Sutton passed away in Spring Hill, Florida, at the age of 79. His death was almost anticlimactic. No last-minute escape, no dramatic exit. It was just the end of the line for a man who had lived on borrowed time for decades. In the end, his death marked the conclusion of a chapter that had been written not in ink, but in a trail of crime, daring escapes, and a remarkable ability to remain one step ahead of the authorities. But as Sutton's body was laid to rest, a different kind of reckoning began to take shape in the world around him. The legacy of Willie Sutton was far from finished. His story had evolved from that of a common criminal to something far more mythic. He had become a symbol, an archetype of the elusive, untouchable criminal, who operated outside the bounds of law and order. In his final years, Sutton had been reduced to a figure of curiosity, a man who had escaped the law but not time. His legend persisted, in part because it reflected something deeper within the psyche of the American public, the desire to challenge authority, the desire for freedom at all costs. But his story was also one of tragedy. For all his daring escapes, Sutton had never truly escaped the consequences of his actions. He had lived a life of crime, and though he had evaded the law for years, he could never escape the darkness of his own choices. His story in the end was a cautionary tale, a reminder that, no matter how many walls one could scale, or fates one could outrun, time and responsibility would catch up eventually. As Sutton's name faded into history, the world around him began to reflect the changes that had been brought about by his life of crime. Law enforcement agencies, particularly the FBI, had taken notes on the failures of the system that had allowed Sutton to evade capture for so long. The FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives list had been created in part because of Sutton's ability to elude capture for so many years. The methods he had employed, disguises, careful planning, and his ability to blend into any situation were now being studied by the very agencies that had once pursued him. Sutton had inadvertently changed the landscape of criminal investigations, forcing the system to adapt and become more vigilant. His story had made law enforcement stronger, more sophisticated, and more aware of the vulnerabilities in their system. Yet, for all the lessons Sutton's life had provided to law enforcement, there was still one final question that loomed over his legacy. Why? Why had Sutton, a man who had so clearly mastered the art of escape, continued to live a life of crime? What was the driving force behind his repeated robberies, his repeated escapes, his repeated defiance of the law? Some said it was about money. Sutton was certainly no stranger to wealth. Others said it was about power, the power to outwit the system, to prove that he could never be caught. But perhaps the most likely explanation was that Sutton craved something even more elusive than money or power: freedom. The ultimate irony of his life was that he had spent so much time evading capture, only to face the one thing that no man could escape: time itself. Sutton had lived his life on his own terms, escaping from prison and law enforcement at will. But in the end, the law and life had both caught up with him. The final reckoning had come, not through a daring escape, but through the simple fact that every man's time runs out. Willie Sutton had evaded the law, but in the end, the law of nature was the one thing he could not escape. As Sutton's story closed, it left behind a legacy that was far more complicated than that of a mere bank robber. He had been both a criminal and a myth, a symbol of resilience and defiance. But as the world moved on, one thing was clear: no matter how many times Sutton escaped, he could never escape the consequences of his own actions. Willie Sutton's death, in 1980, brought an end to one of the most remarkable and tumultuous criminal careers in American history. A life of daring robberies, intricate escapes, and a relentless pursuit of freedom had drawn the attention of the nation for over 20 years. From his first bold bank heists to his legendary prison breaks, Sutton had become a symbol of the criminal underworld, a figure who embodied the tensions between authority and individualism. But as the world moved on from his death, the questions surrounding his life and legacy became more complex, and the impact of his actions would ripple through history for years to come. After his death, Sutton's story remained entrenched in public consciousness. He had been a figure of fascination during his life, one of the most elusive criminals in American history. But in the years following his passing, His name was woven into the fabric of both criminal folklore and criminal justice reform. Sutton's career, particularly his ability to evade the law, became the subject of study within law enforcement circles, leading to the rethinking of how fugitives should be tracked and handled. The legacy of Sutton's escape artistry and his elaborate robberies left its mark on the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. His repeated escapes from maximum security prisons, often executed with remarkable precision, exposed the vulnerabilities in the prison system. Law enforcement agencies were forced to adapt, refining their surveillance, tracking methods, and prison security protocols. Sutton had become a case study in how criminals could exploit the weaknesses in the system. The FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives list, which Sutton had been one of the first criminals to appear on, was an evolving reflection of the agency's commitment to capturing the country's most dangerous and elusive criminals. The lessons Sutton had taught law enforcement about the unpredictability of crime would resonate for decades. His story was woven into training manuals, criminal psychology courses, and investigative tactics, as officials recognized that not all criminals could be caught by traditional means. But while Sutton's influence shaped the future of law enforcement, the psychological impact of his crimes remained felt by his victims. The families and individuals affected by his robberies and escapes were not part of the criminal folklore that was built around Sutton. To them, Sutton was not a figure of fascination or a living legend. He was a criminal who had disrupted their lives in deeply personal ways. The employees at the Corn Exchange Bank, the jewelry store attendants, and the victims of Sutton's many other robberies all carried the trauma of his actions. For them, Sutton was not an icon, but a man whose crimes had left lasting scars. The fears Sutton instilled in his victims and the lives he disrupted remained a hidden but important consequence of his criminal career. Sutton may have escaped the law time and again, but he could never escape the consequences of the lives he affected. Sutton's own life in prison had been shaped by his attempts to redefine his existence within the confines of law enforcement's control. The fact that he spent so many years plotting his escapes showed that despite his legendary status as a bank robber, Sutton was driven by more than just greed or criminal ambition. His need for freedom, his desire to outsmart the system at every turn, and his drive to escape confinement seemed to outweigh any material wealth he gained. It was freedom, not money, that Sutton valued the most, a theme that permeated every aspect of his criminal career. After his release from prison in 1969, Sutton's brief return to society revealed the full paradox of his life. He had spent most of his adult years living as an outlaw, yet upon his release, he became a television spokesperson for a bank credit card company. It was the ultimate irony. A man who had spent decades robbing banks, avoiding capture, and living a life in direct opposition to the financial system, now found himself promoting a new form of banking. Sutton had been a criminal, but he had also become a piece of American commercial culture, a symbol of the strange way society sometimes forgives, or at least forgets, the actions of its most famous criminals. His post-prison life was filled with irony and absurdity, a reminder that the line between criminality and mainstream acceptance could be shockingly thin. Despite the absurdity of his later years, Sutton's story also reflected deeper societal tensions. His legendary status as a master escape artist resonated with a broader sense of rebellion and disillusionment that defined much of America in the early and mid-20th century. Sutton's robberies occurred during a time when the country was grappling with economic upheaval, civil rights struggles, and political turmoil. Sutton had become a symbol for many of the working-class frustrations of the time. A man who had found his way to wealth and freedom by defying authority. For some, his crimes were a statement against a rigid societal structure that seemed to reward the powerful and punish the powerless. For others, he was simply a criminal who took advantage of the system for his own gain. Either way, Sutton's rebellion against authority resonated with the broader themes of the American experience. After Sutton's death, a documentary, countless books, and even academic studies delved into the details of his life. His robberies were analyzed for their precision and planning, while his escapes became a symbol of both criminal genius and the vulnerability of the justice system. He became part of the pantheon of infamous American criminals, alongside figures like John Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde, whose names lived on long after their deaths. Willie Sutton's name became synonymous with the archetype of the gentleman criminal, a man who, despite his illegal acts, retained a sense of style, finesse, and charm that made him more romanticized in the public imagination. But Sutton's death, and the subsequent mythologizing of his life, did little to resolve the fundamental issue at the heart of his criminal career, the system he had so expertly outwitted. Sutton had escaped from the law, but the law had ultimately caught up with him, and in the end, that was the legacy Sutton left behind. His story was not just a tale of criminal success. It was a lesson about the limits of freedom and escape. As much as Sutton had tried to evade the system, he could not evade the consequences of time. No one could. Sutton's life and death marked the end of an era, a time when criminals like him could operate with relative impunity, escaping the law time and time again. The world had changed. Law enforcement had learned from Sutton's mistakes, and the FBI's tactics evolved. His capture became the symbol of the government's growing sophistication in its pursuit of criminals. Ultimately, Willie Sutton's story came to be remembered as one of tension between the freedom he sought and the justice that finally caught up with him. He had spent his life running, but in the end he was still a man bound by the constraints of the system he had fought for so long to evade. Sutton's death did not mark the end of his impact. It only ensured that his myth would continue to linger in the public consciousness for years to come. The man who had escaped for so long had ultimately been claimed by time itself. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.